If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers, maybe not even for sleep, maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push, they float. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe, only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that barely breathe. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly. Like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. She carved her face into coins. That part you've heard before. The profile of Cleopatra, soft-lipped and sharp-eyed, pressed into silver and passed from hand to trembling hand. But the real story didn't shimmer in metal. It drifted quietly through water. There's a strange paradox about rivers. They're always moving, yet they never seem to leave. The Nile especially. It flowed beneath empires, through droughts and dynasties, carrying papyrus boats and forgotten prayers. But for a moment, a soft, dim moment, it wasn't the river that held power. It was Cleopatra, standing beside it, saying the name no one else dared to speak. Rome recorded everything. It wanted to remember victories, taxes, borderlines scratched onto scrolls. But Rome never wrote down the Nile's real name, the name Cleopatra whispered during ceremonies, the one her priests claimed could coax the river into flooding, or hold it still. They never built a statue for that moment. No inscription survives, but imagine her there, by the water's edge, before the empire's noise reached Alexandria's stone docks, her sandals pressed into cool mud, linen robes damp at the hem, and breath a slow breath, softer than speech offered, not to an audience but to a river older than kings. It wasn't just ritual, it was survival. Egypt didn't depend on battles. Not really. It depended on the Nile flooding at the right time, rising quietly to spread silt across the fields. Without it, crops withered, people followed, kingdoms starved into silence. Cleopatra understood this better than Rome ever would. Rome thought in walls and swords, in loud senate chambers and louder processions. Cleopatra thought in floods and droughts, in the soft murmur of temple prayers, in the still spaces between seasons when the river hesitated. Historians still argue about whether she believed in magic, or whether it was just politics wrapped in silk. But does it matter? The ceremonies worked, at least long enough to keep Egypt breathing. And sometimes, belief isn't about truth, it's about repetition, saying something soft often enough until the world decides to listen. Imagine the scene. Torches flicker, but don't burn too bright. The ceremony is meant for the dim hours, not the glare of day. The priests chant words older than any language carved into the Rosetta stone. Cleopatra stands silent at first, then leans toward the water, whispering, not loudly, but with precision. Not in Greek, not in Latin, in Egyptian, the language of the land. Not the conquerors, oh. No Roman senator could have understood her that night. To them, she was either dangerous or decorative. Never both, but Cleopatra had learned how to be both. She could sit still in marble halls and hold empires in conversation, or she could slip barefoot into a temple where no coin carried her face and remind the river who ruled here. The name she whispered wasn't the public name, the Nile, the great river. Iteru, Hapi, those were names for statues and scrolls. The name she spoke was softer. It may have sounded more like a breath than a word. Some scholars believe it was a secret title passed from pharaoh to pharaoh, meant to be spoken only once a year, during the river rites. Others think it was a sound meant to imitate water itself, a name that drifted, hollow and slow, across the night air. Whatever it was, Rome didn't take it from her. They took her kingdom, her armies, her monuments, but not the river's true name that stayed beneath the surface. So it's strange how empires work so hard to erase things, yet miss the softest parts. Rome eventually made Egypt into a province. Senators renamed cities. They issued new coins with new faces. But the water kept flowing the same way, brushing against the same stones, circling the same reeds. The Nile never swore loyalty to Rome. It flooded when it wanted, and it dried when it wanted. And sometimes, in the hollow hours just before dawn, when the streets of Alexandria were still, Cleopatra would meet the river in secret, not as a queen demanding tribute, but as a woman remembering the words no one else could hear. Some nights aren't long, they're just wide, like a field no one crossed. It wasn't enough to wear the crown, not in Egypt, not in the soft, hollow space where politics met ritual. For Cleopatra, ruling the Nile meant more than issuing decrees from a marble throne or speaking before trembling ambassadors. It meant standing beside the water, in the dim spaces where the empire's reach loosened, and doing something no Roman ever understood, asking the river to rise. The Roman world, for all its legions and law codes, never learned how to speak softly to the earth. They paved it, built over it, commanded it to obey. But Egypt had learned long before Rome existed that you don't command rivers, you convince them, slowly, quietly, with offerings, with stillness, with ceremony. Cleopatra inherited more than her father's throne. She inherited the responsibility of making sure the Nile kept flowing. Her rule wasn't just over cities or soldiers, but over time itself, because when the river didn't rise, the calendar broke, and with it, the fragile rhythm of Egyptian life. A mist flood meant fields turning hollow beneath the sun, granaries soft with dust, and entire villages kneeling under skies that refused to rain. That's why she kept the old rites, even as Rome called her a seductress and a sorceress. They never saw the long nights she spent in temples older than memory, where the priests whispered chants into the stone, and Cleopatra whispered something even quieter into the dark. It wasn't performance, it was maintenance, a kind of ancient diplomacy, not with foreign leaders, but with water and silt. Most of the time, the ceremonies happened out of sight. Alexandria's streets would go still. Torch flames pressed low. Inside the temple, the air grew thick with incense, not the heavy Roman frankincense, but softer blends, blue lotus, myrrh, the faint sweetness of desert herbs crushed beneath stone. Cleopatra would stand near the sacred basin, barefoot, her linen robes brushing against the wet floor. Her voice wouldn't carry past the walls. But that was the point. Some prayers are meant to be kept between breath and river. And the Nile, soft, still, always listening, carried those words out of the temple and into the currents. Historians debate whether these ceremonies had any real effect on the floodwaters. The more pragmatic scholars say the rituals were symbolic, a way of showing the people that the queen hadn't forgotten them. But some believe Cleopatra held a deeper knowledge, passed quietly from pharaoh to pharaoh, about the cycles of the Nile. Perhaps she noticed patterns no Roman governor cared to learn: the shape of clouds above Nubia, the wind's hollow pause before rains, the way the reeds shivered faintly before the river rose. The Nile's flood, after all, wasn't just a mystery, it was a negotiation. The river didn't belong to kings or empires, it belonged to itself, and Egypt merely borrowed it year by year. Cleopatra, unlike her Roman counterparts, knew how to keep asking. When the floodwaters finally arrived, usually in mid-July, the city would awaken, not with fanfare, but with a soft awareness, the smell of wet earth, the shimmer of silt catching on sandals, farmers quietly marking their doorways with soot to thank the river for returning. These were not victories Rome could measure, but Cleopatra understood them as victories all the same. She didn't just rule through diplomacy and war, she ruled through the faintest of agreements, like promising the Nile it wouldn't be forgotten. The rituals weren't always solitary. Of course, sometimes the temple filled with priests, each one chanting in a rhythm that matched the river's pulse. The Opet festival in particular blurred the line between politics and ritual. It wasn't just a religious event. It was statecraft in linen robes. Cleopatra would process through Alexandria in soft garments, dressed as Isis, her face still but her eyes sharp. Rome might have seen it as theatrics, but to Egypt, it was reassurance, a reminder that someone still knew the words to say when the river's surface looked too still. During these ceremonies, she would sometimes slip into first person as Isis, speaking softly not to her people, but to the river itself. Some surviving texts hint at phrases like, "I have come to wake the waters," or "Let the soft flood carry us again." These were not public decrees. They were private bargains, murmured under breath, like promises no one wanted to break. There's a strange kind of power in knowing the world still depends on things it can't explain. Rome had roads and legions, Egypt had the Nile, and Cleopatra, standing at the river's edge, knew that for all the Roman governors sent to supervise her kingdom, none of them had learned to whisper to the water. Soft power isn't always about negotiation tables and scrolls. Sometimes it's about knowing when not to speak loudly, when to stay still until the river listens. At night, after the ceremonies, she often lingered by the water. Alexandria's skyline columns, statues, grand facades blurred into shadows behind her. The wind off the river carried no message, but that didn't mean it was empty. She might have whispered the river's name again. This time, not for ceremony but for herself, a hollow sound, half memory, half ritual, the kind of name you don't teach to anyone else because it stops working once you do. You can imagine her there, the last queen of Egypt, knowing that her power wouldn't survive the century, but hoping her soft rituals might last longer in the river's memory than they would in Rome's histories. Not every silence is empty. Some were designed that way, on purpose. It's easy to forget now, but Cleopatra's reign was not a parade of war councils and lavish feasts. At least not always. Much of it unfolded quietly, beneath silk canopies and temple shadows, in the places where statecraft was soft, almost invisible. To rule Egypt was not simply to hold court. It was to understand the tempo of water, to match the breath of an empire to the slow, hollow rhythm of the river. Cleopatra had learned this from the priests, the astronomers, and the farmers, those who knew that time in Egypt was not measured by calendars alone, but by how the Nile chose to behave each year. The Nile was never just a river. It was Egypt's clock, its bloodstream, its soft-spoken god. Cleopatra ruled by aligning herself with that ancient pulse, not by forcing it to bend. No Roman could quite grasp this, because Rome measured power in terms of conquest territories marked off with lines on a map, statues erected to announce dominance, armies marching in formation beneath metal standards. But rivers don't care for borders. The Nile would flood whether Rome approved or not, would leave silt or silence in its wake, indifferent to senatorial debates or imperial commands. Cleopatra's authority, therefore, rested not solely on titles or alliances, but on her ability to stand still in the right places, at the right moments, and remind the elements that she knew their names. Historians often frame her as a political strategist or a symbol of seduction, but this overlooks the deeper work she did presiding over ceremonies that were older than her dynasty, and perhaps older than memory itself. In these rituals, she became both queen and caretaker, guardian of Egypt's fragile balance with the river that kept it alive. There were nights when she would meet with the temple priests in chambers carved so long ago that the walls themselves had softened, worn down by centuries of whispered prayers. Candles would burn low, casting dim halos against stone surfaces, while the air grew thick with resin smoke. These were not the spaces where generals plotted or ambassadors negotiated. These were places hollowed out for listening, for repeating words designed to hold back drought, for persuading the Nile to rise just enough and not too much, The rituals demanded precision, not spectacle. Cleopatra performed her role carefully. She spoke softly, as the priests instructed. Because the river listened better in stillness, they told her to wait for a specific hour. When the night had cooled just enough to hold breath without breaking it, she would stand barefoot, linen robes trailing along damp stones, and recite phrases in ancient Egyptian, not Greek, not Latin, the language of the land. Layered with meanings Rome could never fully translate. This wasn't for Roman ears, this was for the Nile. One phrase often repeated in temple texts was, "Let the flood carry both grain and quiet." Another was even softer. "May the river remember us kindly." These were not demands. They were invitations, gentle suggestions offered to a force that could just as easily ruin as restore. Some scholars now argue that Cleopatra's rituals had no measurable impact on the river's behavior. Others suggest she may have had access to observations, weather patterns, early hydrological knowledge that let her predict floods with startling accuracy, using ritual as a cloak for science. Either way, the ceremonies mattered, not just for belief, but for control. The act of whispering to the Nile was also a way of whispering to the people. Egypt watched their queen participate in rites that reassured them the world still functioned in its proper order. When Cleopatra stood at the water's edge, murmuring sacred syllables, she wasn't just performing for the gods. She was anchoring a fragile social contract. The farmers in the Delta, the merchants in Alexandria, the fishermen along the banks, they all depended on the idea that someone was tending to the river's moods. This kind of power isn't loud. It doesn't shout from balconies or stamp decrees in wax. It's a softer thing, woven into the daily breath of a civilization that knows it lives between flood and famine. Cleopatra understood this better than her Roman counterparts, who thought of governance as something declared from podiums. Egypt required governance of a different kind. Quiet, still, time to the river's slow shift from dry to wet. In Rome, senators whispered about her in darker terms. They called her dangerous, a sorceress, a manipulator. Some believed she held the Nile's fate in her hands, not through wisdom, but witchcraft. But Rome mistook softness for subterfuge. They didn't understand that quiet control done with patience, not poison, was the oldest form of rule along the Nile. Even in moments of personal loss or political instability, Cleopatra kept her focus on the river's cycle. When Rome sent armies or threatened her position, she still appeared at the ceremonies, still whispered the same soft phrases into the air. Her survival, and that of Egypt, depended on consistency. Empires could change, alliances could break, but the Nile had to keep moving. Sometimes you don't hold power by gripping it tightly. Sometimes you hold it by letting it flow through your fingers, like water, trusting that it will return. The temple doors often closed after these rites, leaving behind only traces, the hollow echo of footsteps retreating, the soft cooling of incense fading into walls. The river would seem the same the next morning, glinting under the sunrise, as if nothing had happened. But Egypt believed something had changed. That was the point. Ceremony isn't always about visible results. It's about reinforcing the shape of the world, even if just for one more season. And when Cleopatra left the temple, her face returning to the public mask of rulership, she carried with her the same secret silence. No decree was issued. No Roman envoy was informed. Yet somehow, in the stillness of those nights, she had done the work of an empire. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. The ceremonies by the river were not isolated events. They were part of a larger tapestry that Cleopatra wove quietly, almost invisibly, across her reign. To most of the Roman world, she appeared as a singular figure, exotic, dangerous, cunning, but in Egypt, she was something else entirely. She was the steward of a system older than Rome itself, a guardian of cycles that did not fit neatly into Roman categories of conquest or governance. Her rituals at the Nile were not outliers. They were central, woven into the political and spiritual life of Egypt. with a soft but deliberate thread. In Alexandria, the city she ruled from, life continued in its complex rhythm. Merchants set up stalls in the morning markets. Philosophers debated under the colonnades, and sailors arrived at the harbor with ships heavy from trade. But beneath all of that commerce and chatter, the city breathed in time with the river. Every citizen, from grain clerk to fisherman, knew the flood mattered more than any proclamation from the palace steps. Cleopatra understood this deeply. She wasn't just a ruler of people, she was a ruler of time, or at least of how time unfolded in Egypt's landscape. When she met with advisors, it wasn't always about Rome's threats or diplomatic intrigues. Often, it was about grain reserves, flood levels, and the faint indicators that might suggest the river's behavior for the coming season. The priests brought her reports, not just of omens, but of watermarks, soft impressions left on stone walls from previous floods, telling their quiet history in inches rather than proclamations. These were the true records that mattered in Egypt. A dynasty could fall, but if the Nile failed, life itself would collapse. This is why Cleopatra continued the ancient practice of reading the nilometers, the carefully marked columns in temples and riverbanks that measured the flood's height each year. If the waters rose too high, it meant destruction, washed out fields, drowned villages, chaos. But if they stayed too low, famine would follow. Balance was everything. The priests would walk barefoot into these stone chambers, often alone, to observe the lines on the columns, then report softly to the queen. Sometimes, these consultations happened before dawn, while the city still slept, because that was when the air was quiet enough to hear the river's mood. Cleopatra, unlike her Roman contemporaries, participated directly in this process. She didn't send proxies or issue orders from a distance. She stood beside the nilometers herself, reading the faint grooves where past seasons had left their marks. She traced her fingers along the soft, worn stone, not as a ruler giving commands, but as a student trying to listen. This wasn't about superstition. It was about attention, about knowing when the earth was asking for patience, and when it was signaling danger. That's something Rome never understood. Rome saw rivers as obstacles or resources, things to be crossed or taxed, not partners in survival. But Cleopatra knew that Egypt's entire empire rested on an annual conversation with the Nile, and she spoke its language carefully, never rushing, never forcing. This wasn't about control in the Roman sense. It was about alignment. To rule the flood, you had to become a part of it, slipping into its timing rather than dragging it into yours. Sometimes the ceremonies were quiet, even within the temples themselves. There were nights when Cleopatra and the high priests met in the innermost chambers, where the walls were painted with scenes no foreigner would ever see. Soft light from oil lamps danced across the images of gods and kings, of rivers and offerings, the air thick with incense and silence. They would begin the chants not for spectacle, but because the repetition itself mattered. Words, spoken softly in a hollow chamber, had weight. They pressed into the walls, into the stillness, into memory. Some of these rituals required offerings to the Nile, a bowl of milk, a cloth of linen, or sometimes a handful of barley cast into the water with a whispered phrase. These were not grand gestures meant for public display. They were quiet transactions, small acts of trust between humans and the river that fed them. Cleopatra's role in these ceremonies wasn't symbolic. It was active. She made the offerings herself, letting the fabric float away, watching the grain disappear beneath the soft current. There's a kind of leadership that happens when no one is watching. It's not recorded in official histories or etched into monuments. It happens in the dark, beneath layers of ceremony and ritual, in the spaces where rulers negotiate, not with other rulers, but with the land itself. Cleopatra operated in this space with precision. She knew the names of the river's moods, the softness of its promises, the hollow warnings it gave when the rains in the south came too early or too late. Historians still debate whether she believed the river listened, or if she simply understood the need for the people to believe it did. But belief, in the end, creates its own reality. By standing beside the Nile, by whispering the phrases only the priests taught her, Cleopatra maintained not just political power, but ecological harmony, an arrangement as delicate as silk in a breeze. It's worth noting that she didn't do this alone. The temple networks that supported her were vast and complex, filled with individuals who had spent their lives learning how to read shadows, how to interpret cloud patterns over distant hills, how to listen to the faint sounds of reed beds before a flood. But Cleopatra was not content to remain distant from these practices. She stepped into them directly, merging her political identity with a softer, older role mediator between earth and sky. Some rulers conquer by sword, some by decree. Cleopatra ruled with a slower method through alignment with forces no empire could outmarch. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. There's a difference between ruling an empire and tending to one. Rome often forgot that. Their governors counted taxes and grain exports, sent reports back to the Senate, and held court in marble halls. But few of them learned the silent responsibilities of care, the kind that doesn't announce itself with trumpets or parade armor. Cleopatra, on the other hand, understood that Egypt required attention beneath the surface. It wasn't just about controlling trade routes or commanding armies. It was about tending to the soft places where power lived quietly, the riverbanks, the temple rituals, the unspoken agreements between ruler and land. The Nile was not loyal to kings or queens. It was loyal to its own rhythm, its own hollow breathing, rising and falling in cycles older than the pyramids. Cleopatra knew she could not control it, but she could align with it, reading its signs, honoring its moods, treating it not as a servant but as a partner. When Roman historians later wrote about her, they rarely mentioned these duties. They spoke of alliances and seduction, of military strategies and golden barges, but they ignored the long, quiet nights when she stood by the water's edge, listening for the faint murmur of the current and waiting for the flood to declare itself. This is why her relationship with the Nile became so central to her reign. It wasn't just political, it was existential. Egypt's wealth came from the harvest, and the harvest came from the flood. Every grain of wheat, every basket of barley, every soft loaf of bread eaten in Alexandria's marketplaces was a gift from the river. But the Nile's generosity was not guaranteed. 1 year of low floods meant tighter belts. 2 years could mean famine. 3 years, and Egypt would begin to hollow out from within, its soft underbelly exposed to revolt or invasion. Cleopatra never let it reach that point. She studied the signs with the priests, examining the clouds that formed in the southern reaches of the empire, learning to read the wind's faint messages as it carried stories from Nubia and beyond. The river's rise wasn't random. It followed patterns that could be traced by those willing to stand still long enough to notice. She met regularly with the astronomers, who charted the stars, not just for omens, but for flood prediction. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the star they called Sopdet, signaled the coming of the flood. When Sirius appeared just before dawn, soft and faint against the dark sky, the priests whispered it to Cleopatra first. The ceremonies that followed were not for show. They were rooted in the deep need to maintain balance, to acknowledge forces beyond human control. Cleopatra presided over them not as a distant monarch, but as an active participant, her voice blending with the priests' chants, her breath synchronizing with the still air of the temple corridors. When she spoke the secret names of the river, it wasn't just about magic or superstition. It was about stepping into a role that bridged the gap between ruler and nature, between human desire and elemental force. The true name of the Nile, the one Cleopatra whispered during these rites, was not written down. No scroll survives to tell us what it was. Some scholars believe it wasn't a word at all, but a sound, a soft exhalation, a hollow breath, something between speech and silence. In ancient Egyptian belief, names had power. To speak a name was to summon its essence, Public names were for statues and inscriptions. Secret names were for rituals, carried softly between breath and river, never recorded, never repeated outside sacred spaces. Cleopatra learned this from the priests of Heliopolis and Philae, from the keepers of temple lore, whose memories stretched back through dynasties. They taught her how to move in ritual, how to lift her hands in the correct angle when addressing the river, how to make offerings without breaking the soft stillness required for the moment to hold. Linen veils covered her face during the most sacred parts, not as concealment, but as a signal that the queen, like the priests, was stepping into a role larger than herself. And there's something almost impossible to translate about these acts into modern terms. Today, we measure leadership in policies, decisions, public speeches, but Cleopatra's power often rested in moments no historian bothered to record: the dim hours before dawn, the soft lapping of water against stone, the silent prayers offered not to gods of war, but to the river that made life possible. Her reign was not just about resisting Roman expansion. It was about maintaining the fragile contract between Egypt's people and their land. When Rome finally came for her, it wasn't because of these ceremonies. They saw only the surface: her alliances with Julius Caesar, her relationship with Mark Antony. The ships docked in Alexandria's harbor, but the Nile did not rise or fall for Rome. It followed its own logic, its own softness, ignoring the battles and politics that swirled around it. Cleopatra knew this. She knew that long after Rome's victories faded into statues and broken columns, the river would continue, carrying silt and stories no empire could erase. The Nile doesn't keep records the way humans do. It keeps patterns, eddies, the slow reshaping of banks, the hollow smoothing of stone. It remembers differently. Cleopatra may have vanished from power, her coins melted, her city captured, but the river carried echoes of her reign in its current, soft and indifferent, flowing past the remnants of temples where her name had once been whispered into still air. Even now, if you stand beside the Nile in the dim hours before morning, when the world is still and the river moves almost without sound, you might imagine those ancient ceremonies lingering beneath the surface. The water doesn't speak in words, but sometimes it feels like it listens. And somewhere, beneath the silt and time, the secret name Cleopatra gave the river may still hum quietly, just out of reach. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. For Cleopatra, understanding the river's language was never about personal vanity or mystical performance. It was about survival. Egypt existed because the Nile allowed it to exist. And Cleopatra's most important task, beneath the gold and politics, beneath the carefully composed letters to Rome and the jeweled audiences with foreign emissaries, was to keep that ancient relationship intact. She knew that Rome might conquer cities and silence armies, but no amount of military precision could force a river to flood. In the minds of the Egyptians, the Nile was not simply a geographical feature. It was a living presence, a god wrapped in water, shifting between mercy and punishment without warning. For thousands of years, rulers had presented themselves as the intermediaries between people and river, promising to maintain mat, the delicate balance between chaos and order that kept Egypt afloat. Cleopatra, even with her Greek ancestry and Hellenistic court, stepped into this role fully. She wasn't just playing queen in the Alexandrian palaces. She was engaging in the same rituals as the pharaohs before her, aligning her reign with the forces that didn't care for politics, but cared deeply about cycles: planting, harvest, flood, drought. There are records, faint and fragmentary, that suggest Cleopatra may have participated in ceremonies designed specifically to recalibrate this balance. These weren't grand spectacles for public consumption, but quiet observances, often conducted at night or during the soft light of early dawn, when the city's markets were still asleep and the streets near the harbor remained hollow and empty. In these moments, she wasn't the queen of coins or the queen of Rome's gossip chains. She was simply a woman standing beside a river, offering something of herself, a breath, a word, a silence in exchange for the hope of another season. Some scholars suggest that Cleopatra kept a private scroll, separate from the official state records, where she wrote down patterns of the flood, the height of the waters, the color of the silt, the way the fish swam closer to the shore when the rains in the south came early. This wouldn't have been superstition. It would have been data, carefully collected, quietly recorded. While Rome's historians framed her as a manipulator of men, she was likely spending part of her reign as a careful observer of nature, treating the Nile's behavior as something that required attention, not conquest. The river did not respond to declarations or senatorial votes. It answered to observation, to respect, and to the subtle calibration of human ritual with natural cycle. Cleopatra's ceremonies were not about forcing the river to behave, but about signaling to her people and perhaps to herself that she was listening, that she was paying attention to the rhythms that mattered, even when the rest of the world preferred the louder stories of war and power. During the years when Roman politics spiraled into chaos, the backstabbing in the Senate, the rise of Caesar, the brutal purges of rivals Egypt maintained its own kind of stability, largely because Cleopatra kept the focus on the soft architecture of survival. She distributed grain when floods fell short. She reopened temple granaries to make sure the people would eat through lean months. She coordinated with priests, not just for religious ceremony, but for agricultural management, using the temples as hubs of knowledge where astronomy, weather patterns, and water levels were quietly tracked. This is not the Cleopatra Rome wanted to remember. They preferred the version who seduced Julius Caesar on a gilded barge, the woman draped in silk reclining beneath perfumed canopies. But beneath that image was a queen who spent nights beside temple walls, consulting charts drawn in ink and bone dust, reading the sky for signs that no Roman senator would have bothered to learn. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about endurance. There's a softness in that kind of leadership that doesn't translate well into history books designed for conquest narratives. Cleopatra's power was not always in commanding armies or building alliances through marriage and manipulation. Sometimes, her most critical decisions involved whether to store more grain, whether to adjust temple offerings to account for a slow flood, or whether to alter planting schedules based on readings no one else in Rome even knew existed. These choices didn't come with glory, but they kept Egypt standing. The ceremonies in the temples continued, even as Rome grew closer, its legions moving through the eastern provinces, its envoys writing reports back to Augustus about Egypt's political posture. Cleopatra never stopped performing the rites, even as her alliances with Rome shifted from Caesar to Antony. From negotiation to confrontation, she maintained the annual cycle of Nile rituals. It was as if she understood that no matter what Rome did, the river would still demand attention. The empire might change hands, but the flood would still need its prayers. We don't know the exact words she whispered during those ceremonies. The priests kept them secret, and even the fragments that survive are cloaked in metaphor. Some texts speak of the river as a mouth that must be fed, a hollow hunger that must be soothed. Others describe it as a soft rope winding through the land, pulling Egypt from year to year, its knots measured in floods and famines. Cleopatra would have spoken to this river in phrases designed not for human ears, but for elemental forces language that doesn't command but coaxes. The paradox of power is that it's often exercised in silence. Rome's historians missed this because they weren't listening in the right places. They were listening for declarations, for treaties, for war horns. Cleopatra was speaking softly to the Nile, making sure the next season came, making sure the people who tilled the soil had water for their fields. Her hands weren't always raised in command. Sometimes they were open, palms facing the river, offering nothing but stillness. And the Nile, soft, slow, indifferent to politics, kept flowing. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. By the time Cleopatra reached the later years of her reign, she had mastered the art of waiting, not the passive kind, but a strategic patience that only those who live close to rivers truly understand. The Nile taught her that empires, like floods, have their own cycles. They rise, swell beyond their banks, reshape the land, and eventually recede. Power, she knew, wasn't just about expanding borders or collecting tributes. Sometimes it was about knowing when to stand still, when to let silence stretch long enough for the world to show its next move. In Alexandria, life continued beneath the weight of that knowledge. The merchants in the agora still haggled over spices and silks. The philosophers still argued beneath shaded porticos, tracing ideas across the marble like sand patterns in the wind. The ships still came and went, their sails white against the horizon, but underneath the city's bustle was an awareness, soft but persistent, that everything depended on the river. Cleopatra, for all her alliances with Rome and her careful political maneuvering, kept her attention anchored to the Nile, because she understood that no deal with a foreign power would matter if the river chose silence over flood. This is why, even in the midst of international intrigue, she kept her appointments with the priests. The temple calendars marked the same ceremonies year after year, soft repetitions that anchored Egypt's existence. Some of the rites took place at night, under oil lamps that flickered quietly against sandstone walls. Others unfolded in early morning, while the city's streets were still cool and the shadows long. Cleopatra didn't delegate these responsibilities. She attended personally, knowing that leadership in Egypt was not just a matter of issuing commands, but of aligning herself with the old rhythms that predated her dynasty. One ceremony in particular stood apart from the others, the offering of the waters. It was not a spectacle for the masses. There were no crowds lining the streets, no triumphal arches decorated with laurels. Instead, it happened in the hollow quiet of the riverbank. Usually just before the first signs of the flood, Cleopatra would walk, often alone, but sometimes accompanied by a small group of priests, to a specific point along the Nile, where the water bent in a soft curve. As if pausing before its next move, she would kneel at the edge, gather a small bowl of water from the river itself, and then pour it back in, whispering phrases that no Roman chronicler ever recorded. Some say she may have spoken the river's secret name during this rite. The priest believed that the Nile had many names, public ones, ceremonial ones, but also a private name that could not be written, only spoken in ritual. The idea was not to control the river, but to remind it of its place in the world, to coax it gently back into its role as Egypt's lifeblood. Cleopatra, by participating in this ceremony, wasn't claiming divine power. She was acknowledging a partnership between ruler and river, between human need and natural force. In those moments, she wasn't the woman Rome feared, or the queen they caricatured in scandalous pamphlets. She wasn't the seductress from gossip, or the manipulator of generals. She was simply a figure at the water's edge, aligning her breath with the current, her pulse with the soft, slow rhythm of the flood. This is leadership rarely discussed in political histories, because it doesn't fit into the narrative of conquest or rebellion. But for Egypt, it was the foundation of everything. There are fragments of texts from temple walls that hint at these rites. One of them reads, "The river remembers kindness, not commands." Another states, "When the queen speaks softly, the waters listen better." These aren't metaphors, they are instructions, carved in stone by people who believed that survival was tied to humility before nature's patterns. Cleopatra carried that knowledge into her rule, blending the sharpness of political calculation with the softness of ritual care. Rome, of course, did not understand this. The Senate preferred reports of military engagements, trade agreements, and territorial disputes. They wanted to know about alliances, not offerings. When Roman envoys visited Alexandria, they rarely witnessed the ceremonies by the river. They saw the public displays, the gold, the banquets, the impressive architecture, but they missed the quiet moments that truly held Egypt together. And perhaps that was exactly as Cleopatra intended. She gave Rome the surface view, the version of Egypt they could comprehend, while keeping the deeper rituals wrapped in linen silence. In private, the priests continued to teach her the old chants, passing down the language of the flood as carefully as they might guard a sacred relic. Some of these words, if translated directly, would sound simple to modern ears. They spoke of balance, of breath, of the earth and sky folding into each other at the moment when the river rose. But for those who understood the tradition, the words carried layers of meaning, warnings against arrogance, reminders that no crown lasts forever, and that true power often lies in knowing when not to act. Cleopatra wasn't passive, though her patience wasn't a form of inaction. She prepared for shifts in politics, just as she prepared for changes in the river. She sent envoys to negotiate. She managed alliances, and she maintained diplomatic ties with Rome's shifting factions. But underneath all of that maneuvering was a quieter form of rule, one rooted in listening rather than declaring. It's a leadership style few empires appreciate because it leaves no grand monuments, no victory columns, yet it sustains a nation in ways that conquests cannot tow. If you walked the riverbank in those days, you might have seen her silhouette against the early morning mist, soft, still, blending into the landscape rather than towering over it. She might have held a bowl in her hands, or simply stood with her arms at her sides, letting the wind move through linen folds without resistance. Her lips might have moved in silent prayer, or perhaps she only breathed, synchronizing her rhythm with the water at her feet. Some nights aren't long, they're just wide, like a quiet field no one crosses, stretched out until the morning decides to return. The deeper you move into Cleopatra's reign, the clearer it becomes that much of her rule was shaped not by battles or betrayals, but by the subtle art of timing. She understood that there is power in waiting for the right current, in knowing when to speak and when to let silence fill the room. Like the Nile itself, her leadership was patient, deliberate, and soft in the places where softness carried more weight than any decree. The offering of the waters was just one of many ceremonies where Cleopatra placed herself in alignment with forces beyond her direct control. Another ritual, less known but perhaps even more intimate, was the night vigil at the Nilometer. This practice, rooted in traditions from pharaohs long before the Ptolemies, involved a quiet vigil held in the hollow hours of night, where the queen would sit with the priests beside the measurement column carved deep into a temple's chamber, waiting for the first sign that the flood had begun. These vigils were not spectacles of faith, but practices of attention. The Nile did not announce its rise with grand gestures. It started with small shifts, a change in the scent of the air, a faint cooling of the breeze coming from the south, the hollow sound of water brushing against stones that had been dry for months. The priests had trained their ears for these moments, and Cleopatra joined them, not as an observer, but as a participant, because to rule Egypt was to listen first, to act second. The Nilometer chamber was a place of echoes. Stone walls rose around the central column, each groove marking past floods, some generous, others disastrous. Cleopatra would sit quietly, her linen robes drawn close around her, not speaking unless necessary, letting her mind slow to match the river's pace. This was not a place for politics or intrigue. No Roman ambassador would ever be invited into that room. The power exercised there was not the kind that Rome could understand or replicate. It was the soft governance of nature's tempo, where decisions were made not by force, but by observation. It is tempting to imagine Cleopatra's mind during these vigils, wandering to the larger stage of empire, the shifting alliances in Rome, the ambitions of Octavian, the unpredictable tides of Roman politics. But here, in the stillness of the Nilometer, she allowed those concerns to fade into the background. Her focus remained on the measurements at hand, the carved lines of past seasons, the shadows cast by flickering lamps, the faint ripples that told of rising waters far to the south. This was leadership in its most elemental form, staying awake when no one else was watching, bearing witness to the changes no one else thought to record. There's an old belief among the temple scholars that the flood begins not when the river moves, but when someone notices that it has. Cleopatra, in keeping this vigil, wasn't just performing a rite. She was participating in the act of seeing, a kind of seeing that carried responsibility. If the flood came too soon or too late, she would have to adjust not just ceremonies but policies, trade routes, food storage plans, and even the rhythms of the markets. One shift in the Nile's cycle could ripple out into every corner of Egyptian life. This is why, during the quiet hours beside the Nilometer, Cleopatra didn't just sit passively. She consulted the priests about the possible outcomes of various flood levels. She listened to reports from the southern provinces, noting the behavior of tributaries, the cloud formations above Nubia, the whispers of travelers who had passed through distant villages. Some of these details might seem minor compared to military strategies or royal decrees, but to Cleopatra, they were threads in a larger tapestry. They told her how to prepare for the months ahead, not just agriculturally, but politically. A generous flood meant a surplus of grain, which in turn meant Egypt could feed its population and still export to Rome, strengthening her leverage in negotiations. A weak flood, however, signaled hardship. Grain prices would rise, social tensions might increase, and the balance of power between Alexandria's elite and the rural farmers would become fragile. Cleopatra didn't wait for crises to unfold. She planned during these vigils, mapping out contingencies as softly as the priests whispered prayers into the stone. Some historians dismiss these practices as mere ritual, placing more emphasis on Cleopatra's diplomatic affairs with Caesar and Antony, but this overlooks the quiet infrastructure of survival that underpinned her reign. She didn't treat natural cycles as background details. She treated them as the main event, because they were. The Nile was not a backdrop to Egyptian politics, it was the stage, the script, and sometimes the director. It's likely that, during these vigils, she thought of the Nile not as a resource, but as a kind of co-ruler. Unlike Rome's emperors, who demanded control over land and people through conquest, Cleopatra knew that Egypt's fate was tied to cooperation with the river. The Nile would outlast her dynasty, outlast Rome itself, and she respected that continuity. Her rule wasn't about bending nature to her will, but about weaving herself into its patterns, becoming part of the flood's memory rather than trying to overwrite it. There is a metaphor, still used by scholars of the period, that compares the Nile to a scribe's brush. The river, they say, writes its history across the land in water and silt, leaving behind marks that are sometimes erased and sometimes carved deeper. Cleopatra understood this better than most. She wasn't trying to write her name into the river's story in bold letters. Instead, she whispered it softly, letting the current carry it in the way that water carries everything slowly, persistently, eventually. Her enemies in Rome did not see this side of her. They focused on her alliances, her rumored luxuries, her love affairs. They missed the woman who stayed up through the night to listen to the sound of a river changing shape in the dark. They missed the patience required to rule not just people, but time itself. What if forgetting was never failure, just a softer way to hold weight? When dawn finally came after these vigils, it wasn't always clear whether the river had changed or if the watchers themselves had. Cleopatra would rise from her place beside the Nilometer, her knees stiff from hours of stillness, her mind quietly calculating the implications of what she had or hadn't seen. Sometimes the flood had begun its rise, in which case preparations for the coming season would unfold softly but urgently. Temple announcements, adjustments to grain storage, the coordination of shipments to regions dependent on Alexandria's warehouses. Other times, the water remained still, leaving behind a hollow tension that settled in the back of her thoughts like an unanswered question. In either case, Cleopatra carried the weight of that knowledge back with her, tucked beneath the layers of politics and public performance. To an outside observer, This balance between ritual and strategy might seem contradictory. How could a queen versed in negotiation with Rome also spend her nights counting the river's shadows? But in Egypt, these roles were not separate. The queen's public face, her alliances, her appearances, her decisions in council were for Rome and for her court. The river ceremonies, however, were for Egypt itself, for the farmers in the delta, for the temple networks that still functioned as the backbone of rural administration, and for the quiet machinery of survival that no foreign conqueror could afford to ignore, even if they pretended to. The Nile's flood was not just a natural event. It was the soft engine of the entire Egyptian economy. Grain production determined everything. When the fields received enough water, Egypt became Rome's breadbasket, shipping wheat across the Mediterranean in steady cycles that kept Roman citizens fed and their rulers politically stable. When the floods failed, however, famine loomed not just for Egyptians, but for Rome itself, whose fragile balance of power increasingly depended on Egypt's grain surplus. Cleopatra understood this dependency better than anyone. She wielded it not as a weapon, but as a quiet fact of the geopolitical landscape, knowing that sometimes survival came not from swords, but from knowing exactly how much silt covered the fields each season. This was part of her strategy, not to provoke Rome, but to make herself indispensable to it. She did not control Rome's Senate, nor could she dictate the movements of its generals, but she could ensure that Egypt's grain trade continued to flow just enough to remind Rome of its reliance, while keeping her own people fed and her kingdom afloat. This required more than economic management. It required an intimate knowledge of the river's moods and of the ceremonies designed to maintain its favor, or at least the appearance of favor, which in politics often amounts to the same thing. One of Cleopatra's strengths was her ability to inhabit both of these worlds, the symbolic and the practical, without losing her footing in either. She knew that ceremony alone would not feed her people, but she also knew that neglecting the symbolic would erode her legitimacy. In Egypt, rulers did not simply govern. They performed a role in the cosmic order. They were expected to maintain harmony between earth and sky, between flood and drought, between the hollow silence of waiting and the rush of action when the time came. There are records suggesting that Cleopatra often consulted with the astronomers of the Serapeum, Alexandria's great temple of Serapis, whose scholars tracked the stars not for entertainment but for prediction. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the dog star, was closely monitored as it coincided with the onset of the flood season. Cleopatra paid attention to these signs, combining astronomical observation with ritual timing. Knowing that both science and faith played a role in her people's trust, she wasn't naive about it. She understood the politics of belief, but she also respected the systems that had kept Egypt stable for centuries. The softness of ritual wasn't weakness, it was infrastructure, invisible but essential. Meanwhile, Rome's gaze remained fixed on her in other ways. To Roman propagandists, Cleopatra was increasingly described as a threat cloaked in silk, a seductress capable of bending men to her will, a queen who whispered poison into the ears of powerful allies. This was a convenient narrative, one that obscured the real sources of her strength. Rome didn't want to acknowledge that Cleopatra's power was rooted not just in personal charisma or political maneuvering, but in her role as Egypt's mediator with the natural world, as a ruler who kept the seasons in check through careful partnership with forces that even Rome could not command. In Alexandria, Cleopatra maintained these dual images with precision. Her court was one of the most cosmopolitan in the ancient world, a blend of Greek, Egyptian, and Roman customs woven together with deliberate care. She spoke multiple languages, conducted diplomatic meetings with skill, and composed treaties that reflected the delicate balance of her position. Yet none of these tasks distracted her from the quiet disciplines of ruling a land that still depended on the flood, the harvest, and the hollow spaces between them. It's worth noting that during these years, she also oversaw significant temple restorations, investing in the physical spaces where these ancient ceremonies took place. These were not mere acts of piety or vanity. They were political decisions, meant to reinforce Egypt's continuity in the face of Roman expansion by repairing temples, restoring inscriptions, and supporting the priesthoods. Cleopatra wasn't just preserving history, she was anchoring her present to it, reminding both her people and her enemies that Egypt's identity extended beyond her own reign, beyond any foreign occupation, into the soft currents of time itself. Some of her inscriptions from these temple projects survive, though many have been worn down by centuries of wind and sand. One fragment, carved into the stone walls of Dendera, reads, "She who keeps the flood in season, who holds the balance of sky and earth, who speaks the names that soften the current." It's a simple phrase, but it captures the essence of her role not as conqueror or seductress, but as caretaker of cycles. Leadership like this rarely survives in the louder histories written by victors. Rome preferred stories of battlefields and betrayals, of grand speeches and conquests, but Egypt, in Cleopatra's time, knew that survival came from the soft management of time itself, from knowing when to stand still, when to wait for the river, and when to act, quietly but decisively, before anyone else realized the shift had already begun. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. By the final years of Cleopatra's reign, the balance between ritual and survival had grown even more fragile. The Nile still rose, but not always predictably. Some seasons brought generous floods that painted the land in soft layers of fertile silt, while others arrived hesitant, thin, leaving farmers staring at dry fields where there should have been water. Cleopatra understood that managing these cycles was no longer just a matter of agriculture or religion. It had become a form of political strategy, one more delicate and complex than any negotiation she conducted with Rome. Her relationship with the river wasn't based on superstition. It was built on observation, on generations of recorded knowledge passed down through the temples, on the careful watching of skies and soil, the reading of wind patterns, the hollow murmurs of reed beds shifting against the current. She didn't believe she could command the Nile to flood on schedule, but she also knew that the appearance of control was sometimes just as powerful as control itself. By participating in the rites, by standing at the water's edge and whispering the secret names, she reassured her people that someone was tending to the unseen forces of the world, that the kingdom was not adrift, that the sacred contract between earth, sky, and ruler still held. Cleopatra wove these ceremonies into the fabric of her diplomacy. Though not openly, when she met with Roman envoys, she spoke of trade routes, alliances, the shifting tides of Roman civil war. But beneath those conversations lay a softer strategy, one tied to grain reserves and food shipments that quietly gave Egypt leverage over Rome's increasingly unstable republic. She knew exactly how much grain Alexandria's warehouses could hold. She knew when to release shipments to stabilize the market and when to withhold them to remind Rome of its dependence. Every decision was tethered to the Nile's behavior, and by extension, to the rituals that kept her in rhythm with it. The Opet festival was one of the rare moments when this soft governance became partially visible to the public. During this festival, Cleopatra appeared as Isis, dressed in traditional linen robes, her face framed by a crown of horns and sun disk, walking softly through Alexandria's streets as the crowds watched in reverent silence. The festival wasn't just religious, it was political theater, designed to remind the people that their queen was not merely a political figurehead, but a bridge between the mortal and the divine, between the seen and unseen. She rode in a ceremonial bark down the canal, the procession gliding slowly over water, while priests chanted from the shore, their voices rising and falling in tones meant to match the current's pace. Cleopatra knew the importance of these performances. In times of political uncertainty, reassurance did not come from military parades, but from the soft reiteration of continuity. But even within these grand ceremonies, there were private moments that held more weight than the public displays. Cleopatra maintained her practice of whispering to the Nile in solitude, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in the quiet hours after midnight, when the palace halls had gone still, and only the sound of distant waves against Alexandria's harbor filled the background. These personal offerings were not recorded in any official chronicle, but they were remembered by those close to her advisors, temple attendants, scribes who spoke quietly of the queen's attention to things no Roman would have considered governance. In these moments, she may have thought about her son, Caesarion, whose name tethered him both to Julius Caesar and to Egypt's divine lineage. There are accounts suggesting she whispered his name during certain rites, blending his future with the fate of the river, as if to secure his survival, not just through politics, but through a softer, older form of protection. To bind a child to the Nile was to bind him to Egypt itself, to place him within the river's memory, beyond the reach of Roman ambitions. Historians argue over whether Cleopatra believed in the literal power of these rituals, or whether she performed them for their political utility, but perhaps the distinction is irrelevant. In Egypt, ritual and governance were never truly separate. Belief and administration were interwoven, each reinforcing the other. A ruler didn't simply command armies or pass laws. She tended to the balance of forces seen and unseen, maintaining the hollow spaces where trust and continuity resided. Cleopatra lived within this system, not outside it. She didn't use religion as a tool. From the outside, she participated in it, understanding that the strength of her reign depended on moving with the same patience as the river itself. Sometimes she may have wondered how long the balance could hold. Rome's presence in the eastern Mediterranean was growing louder. Its civil wars spilled over into Egypt's borders, threatening to rupture the soft agreements she had spent years maintaining. But even as Roman generals argued and alliances shifted, Cleopatra continued her rituals. She maintained the temple networks, ensured the festivals proceeded on time, and kept the priests well supported, knowing that the stability of Egypt depended as much on spiritual rhythms as on military defense. She also continued to consult with her astronomers, watching the skies for patterns that might offer clues to the seasons ahead. The priests of the Serapeum, who tracked the movements of the stars with instruments that combined observation and faith, provided her with charts detailing the celestial cycles. These charts weren't superstition, they were calendars, agricultural guides, soft records of time's passage, aligning human activity with the movements of the heavens. Cleopatra used this information not only to plan harvests, but to schedule political decisions, aligning announcements and diplomatic visits with moments of celestial favor. This was not about manipulation. It was about harmony, about moving in step with forces larger than any empire. In private, she may have thought about the risks of this strategy. Rome respected force, not patience. Its generals admired conquest, not ceremony. But Cleopatra knew that Egypt was older than Rome, and older than conquest. It had survived not because of military expansion, but because of its careful management of cycles, its soft governance of land and water, its refusal to rush. Her rituals were part of that inheritance, and she carried them forward not because she believed they would stop Rome, but because they were the correct way to live in this place, at this time. If anything in this stayed behind, you can leave something below, or not. It still counts. This was Boring History Nights. Now let the quiet settle. Let the Nile drift as it always has. The closer Cleopatra moved toward the end of her reign, the more the rituals by the Nile took on a double meaning. On the surface, they remained what they had always been: ceremonies of renewal, acts of alignment with Egypt's natural cycles, ways to mark the passing of time while asking the river to continue its quiet mercy. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. The river rites became a soft defiance against a world that was hardening, against the kind of history that preferred battles and betrayals over silences and seasons. Cleopatra may have known she could not stop Rome from expanding, but she could ensure that Egypt's relationship with the Nile would not be swallowed so easily. This, too, was a form of survival. The rituals continued, as they always had, but with each passing year, the tension beneath them grew. Alexandria became a city of careful faces, merchants watching the harbor for Roman ships, priests whispering in temple corridors, citizens pretending not to notice the shifts in power across the sea. Cleopatra, however, kept her pace steady. She did not allow the panic of politics to interfere with the cycles she had sworn to maintain. Her advisors brought her news of Roman campaigns, of Octavian's rise, of alliances fracturing in places she could not control. But even on days when strategy meetings filled the palace, she still found time to meet with the priests at the riverbank, to whisper into the hollow spaces of the current, to keep Egypt's breath aligned with the flood. It was during this time that she became more than a ruler in the political sense. She became a kind of guardian of memory, of a way of life that was slowly fading but not yet gone. The Nile rites were not about spectacle anymore. They were about continuity, about standing in the same place where generations before her had stood, knowing that the same prayers had been spoken into the same air, under the same stretch of sky, while empires elsewhere rose and fell unnoticed. In those moments, Cleopatra was not just speaking to the river, she was speaking to time itself, asking it to remember. The Nilometer vigils became even more frequent. Her presence at these measurements was not a political gesture for Rome to see. It was a commitment to her own people, to the farmers in the Delta, to the temple networks that managed the harvest cycles, to the caretakers of Egypt's fragile stability. These nightly vigils, soft and unrecorded, were part of the hidden infrastructure of her reign. She wasn't waiting for the river to rise because she was curious. She was waiting because she needed to know how to prepare the kingdom for whatever came next. A generous flood could buy her another season of calm. A weak one might force her to negotiate grain shipments with Rome under terms she could not fully dictate. At times, during these vigils, she may have spoken to her son in whispers, not to the boy himself, but to the idea of him, to Caesarion as a future ruler who might inherit both the throne and the burden of the Nile. Some historians believe she had plans to train him in these same practices, to teach him the soft arts of watching and waiting, of listening to currents instead of crowds. But history didn't give her that time. Rome was already moving against her, step by quiet step, cloaking its ambitions in rhetoric while preparing its fleets. Still, Cleopatra did not let go of the old patterns. She remained present in the temple rituals, in the midnight offerings, in the measurements of silt and water. Her governance stayed rooted in the balance between action and observation, between the hollow space of patience and the necessary firmness of decision. It is difficult now to reconstruct the exact details of these rites, because the records were never meant for public consumption. They were held in temple libraries, whispered between priests, passed down orally through generations that believed sacred knowledge should not be written carelessly. Some fragments survive, though faded and incomplete. A few lines from a temple text suggest a recurring phrase Cleopatra may have spoken during the ceremonies. "Let the waters come softly. Let the fields remember their green." Another fragment reads, "If the river listens, so must we. If the river waits, so must we." These aren't commands. They are invitations to participate in a world where patience is part of survival. It's likely Cleopatra carried these words with her even outside the temple walls, in diplomatic meetings, in conversations with generals, in the private corridors of the palace, where political futures were debated late into the night. She must have remembered the soft lessons of the river, that not everything can be rushed, that timing matters more than force, that stillness is sometimes a form of strength. These ideas are difficult to translate into the language of empire, but for Cleopatra, they were as real as any treaty. Even as Rome prepared for war, she maintained her role as a mediator between Egypt's human systems and its natural ones. She oversaw the management of granaries, worked with temple officials to adjust harvest expectations, and continued to ensure that Egypt's food security remained stable, despite the looming threat of Roman annexation. She understood that no matter what happened on the battlefield, the people would need to eat, and that stability in the fields would keep the kingdom grounded, at least for a while longer. In this sense, her rule was not only about immediate survival, but about the long game, about embedding Egypt's resilience into systems that Rome could not easily dismantle, no matter how many ships they sent. This is where her true leadership often escapes the history books. Her enemies wrote their stories in terms of conquest and scandal, but Cleopatra was writing hers in cycles of flood and grain, in temple calendars, in whispered chants that didn't fit into Roman narratives. She wasn't only fighting for a throne, she was tending to a way of life that saw the world in rhythms, not in battles. Her governance was about preserving the soft agreements between nature and civilization, knowing that once those were broken, no army could restore them. The Nile kept rising. Even as Rome's armies approached, the river did not care about Antony's legions or Octavian's ambitions. It followed its own course, brushing past the borders drawn by human hands, continuing the pattern it had known long before the first senator ever carved a decree into stone. Cleopatra stood beside it, as she always had, patient, watching, whispering the same words into the same hollow air, trusting that some things, at least, remained beyond the reach of empire. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. It was during these final seasons, when the weight of Rome loomed closer, when Alexandria's corridors filled with rumors of war, that Cleopatra returned more often to the temples near the river's edge. Some rulers would have retreated into their palaces at such a time, surrounding themselves with guards, fixating on strategies, or drowning in council meetings that blurred into exhaustion. Cleopatra, however, understood that there was another kind of preparation required, one that had nothing to do with military defenses or political intrigue. She needed to ensure that the rituals continued, uninterrupted, no matter what storm approached. In the hollow chambers of the Temple of Philae, carved into stone and softened by centuries of footsteps, she participated in the rites meant to bind Egypt to its most ancient rhythms. These ceremonies were older than the Ptolemaic dynasty, older even than some of the gods Rome acknowledged, and Cleopatra did not treat them as relics. To her, they were tools of governance, quiet ones, but essential. Each chant, each offering, each soft step taken in procession was part of Egypt's infrastructure, as necessary to its functioning as irrigation channels or grain ledgers. There was a particular ritual, performed only by the queen and the high priests, that focused on the renewal of the waters, a symbolic reawakening of the Nile's promise to the land. Cleopatra knew the words by heart. They were not long incantations, but careful phrases that had to be spoken with precision, in a tone that hovered just above breath. One fragment, preserved in later temple scrolls, suggests that the queen would begin by addressing the river directly. Come gently, as the breath before sleep. Come softly, as the hush before dawn. The language was not about command, but about cooperation. It recognized the river as a partner in Egypt's survival, not a servant to be ordered. These ceremonies did not prevent Rome from coming. Of course, no ritual, however ancient, could stop ships from crossing the sea or armies from assembling beyond the horizon. But Cleopatra's focus was never solely on defense in the traditional sense. She had long understood that physical borders could be taken, that armies could lose battles, but that the softer structures of culture, belief, rhythm, memory were harder to dismantle. The Nile rites, and the knowledge they carried, were part of that softer defense, as long as they remained intact, as long as someone remembered the sequence of gestures, the pattern of words. Egypt would still exist in a way that Rome could not erase. The priests, many of them elders who had served her father and his father before him, noticed her consistency, even when Rome demanded her attention. When embassies arrived from foreign courts, When political alliances trembled under new pressures, she returned to the temple chambers without fail. It was not just a matter of duty. It was a matter of identity. Cleopatra was not merely ruling Egypt. She was becoming part of its ongoing story, woven into the rituals that defined its existence. This is where modern interpretations of her life often falter. Historians tend to separate her political actions from her ceremonial ones, as if diplomacy and ritual belonged to different realms. But in Cleopatra's Egypt, they were the same. To stand before the Nile and whisper the soft names of the flood was to make a political statement that Egypt was still Egypt, despite Rome's shadow, despite the coming wars, despite the inevitability of change. Ritual was not escapism, it was resistance, conducted quietly, with open palms instead of closed fists. There are accounts, though rare, of how Cleopatra prepared for these rites in the final years. She would cleanse herself in lotus-infused water, not for vanity, but because tradition required purification before speaking to the river. She wore robes of undyed linen, the simplest form of royal attire, signifying humility before the gods. In the temple scrolls, there are descriptions of her entering the inner sanctum without jewelry, her wrists bare, her crown replaced with a soft band of cloth, a ceremonial shift that placed her not above the process, but within it. It is said that during these last seasons, the chants carried an additional layer of meaning. The words were the same, but the context had changed. When she whispered, "Let the waters return," she may have been speaking not just of the flood, but of continuity itself, of Egypt's ability to remain, to keep flowing beneath the noise of empire. The river, after all, had outlived conquerors before. It had witnessed the collapse of dynasties, the rise and fall of temples, the hollowing of statues that once promised permanence. Cleopatra's whispers joined that long history, threading her voice into the same current. In some of the temple fragments recovered centuries later, there are faint carvings that suggest these rites included moments of silence, pauses where no words were spoken, where the queen and the priests simply listened to the hollow space between breaths. This was not about performance. It was about participation in the stillness of the world, an acknowledgement that silence is part of governance. 2. The ability to wait, to observe, to stand at the edge of the river without forcing it to speak, was a skill Cleopatra valued as much as any military council. There's a moment recorded in one account, though it is impossible to verify whether it happened exactly as described, where Cleopatra is said to have stood alone by the Nile before sunrise, her attendants at a respectful distance. The priests had completed the formal rites, but she remained, her feet pressed into the cool mud of the riverbank. Watching the water move slowly past her, she did not speak, did not chant. She simply breathed, letting the quiet stretch long enough for the river's rhythm to fold into her own. This was not a moment of defeat. It was not surrender. It was the act of a ruler who knew that survival does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it happens in the spaces where no one is looking, in the soft maintenance of tradition, in the hollow pause between decision and consequence. Cleopatra wasn't trying to stop time. She was aligning herself with its deeper currents, trusting that some things flow beneath the reach of empire. Even now, centuries later, when scholars debate her legacy, the focus often rests on Rome, the wars, the alliances, the political dramas that fill surviving letters and coin inscriptions. But beneath all of that, there was this other Cleopatra, the one who tended to the river, who stood quietly in temple chambers while the world beyond plotted and shifted. Her empire, in those moments, was not measured in land or titles, but in silences, in cycles, in the way the Nile continued to rise and fall, regardless of who sat on thrones. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. As the political world narrowed around her, Cleopatra continued to weave her governance through layers of ceremony, diplomacy, and the soft repetition of rituals that had outlived more than one empire. Rome's appetite for expansion was no longer subtle. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, positioned himself not just as a military leader, but as a symbol of a new era, an era in which independent kingdoms like Egypt would have no place. Yet while Rome sharpened its strategies and readied its fleets, Cleopatra remained focused on the slower work of tending to her country's deeper cycles, those the Roman Senate could not legislate, nor a legionary commander coerce. At the heart of this quiet work was the Nile itself, its flood marking time more faithfully than any calendar Rome could print onto papyrus. The river did not care who held political power in the forum. It rose and fell according to its own logic, and Cleopatra's rituals followed that rhythm with deliberate consistency. Even as Roman ships appeared more frequently along Egypt's coastline, even as spies sent their hollow reports back to Octavian's court, she ensured that the rites of the flood continued unbroken. One such rite, known as the ceremony of binding, took place at the height of the flood's arrival. This was not a grand event meant for public squares or monumental statues. It unfolded within the quiet chambers of temples along the riverbanks, where the queen and the high priests worked together to symbolically bind the waters to the land. Cleopatra did not bind the river in any literal sense. Of course, that was never the purpose of such rituals. The ceremony was about acknowledgement, about reminding both the river and the people that partnership, not control, was the foundation of Egypt's survival. To live beside the Nile was to accept its moods, its occasional cruelty, and its persistent generosity, all woven into the same current. During the ceremony of binding, Cleopatra would stand with the priests beneath carved ceilings painted with stars, her feet placed firmly on temple stone, still cool from the night air. A strip of linen, soft and unadorned, was dipped into the river, then wound carefully around a symbolic pillar in the temple courtyard, a gesture meant to represent the connection between water and land, ruler and people, flood and harvest. The act itself was simple, but its implications were vast. It was a quiet contract, renewed each year, tying Egypt's prosperity to forces larger than any army could contain. The symbolism of the linen mattered. Linen was not gold, not marble, not the material of imperial vanity. It was soft, woven from the flax that grew in Egypt's fields, and it carried within it the labor of ordinary people, the farmers, the spinners, the weavers who formed the hidden network beneath every kingdom. Cleopatra chose this softness on purpose, in a time when Rome celebrated dominance through cold bronze and military banners. She chose cloth as her emblem of connection, a material that wrapped but did not crush, that joined but did not enslave. Rome, of course, would not have understood this gesture. Its senators were writing reports about troop movements, counting coinage, making speeches about Eastern decadence and foreign queens who dared to rule in ways Rome found unsettling. But Cleopatra did not need Rome to understand. Her duty was not to explain Egypt's rituals to foreigners. It was to continue them, to ensure that when the floodwaters receded and the planting began, her people would feel the ground beneath them remain steady, even if the world beyond their fields shifted toward chaos. There's something profoundly strategic about this kind of leadership. Cleopatra knew that the symbols she maintained, ceremonies, linen bindings, whispered prayers at dawn, were not just about personal faith. They were about sustaining a structure of meaning that kept Egypt coherent in a moment when Rome wanted to dissolve it into something else. Culture, she understood, is not defended only with walls and armies. It is also defended with repetition, with rituals that tether a people to their land, to their seasons, and to their own quiet sense of who they are when no one is watching. These acts of care were not always dramatic. Some mornings, Cleopatra simply visited the temple granaries to review the stores of grain, confirming with the priests how much had been saved, how much could be shared, how much needed to be held back in case the next flood came late. Other times, she met with astronomers to cross-check their readings of the stars, aligning Egypt's agricultural calendar not with Rome's politics, but with the slow turning of the sky. Her leadership was a weaving of the soft and the hard, the celestial and the practical, the symbolic and the logistical. Some of her Roman critics accused her of distraction, of spending too much time in temples while Rome plotted, but they misunderstood entirely. Cleopatra was not distracted. She was deliberate. She knew that empires collapse not just through military defeat, but through the erosion of memory, of ritual, of the small, soft acts that hold a society together when its larger structures start to crack. If she could keep Egypt's internal systems intact, if she could keep the ceremonies alive, the granaries full, the river acknowledged, then even if Rome claimed political victory, Egypt would remain Egypt in ways no conqueror could fully erase. In this, Cleopatra showed a different kind of strength, not the brittle arrogance of unchecked power, but the flexible endurance of someone who understood how to outlast crisis by moving with it, not against it. She chose softness where Rome chose steel, patience where they chose haste. She knew that hollow victories fade quickly, but the quiet maintenance of life planting, harvesting, binding the flood to the land echoes long after swords are set down. There is a line in one surviving temple inscription from this time, faded but still legible under layers of dust and sand. It reads, "The flood comes for no empire. It comes for the fields." Cleopatra would have understood this completely. She wasn't ruling for statues or future historians. She was ruling for the farmers who woke before the sun, for the scribes who tracked grain by torchlight, for the priests who whispered to the river because someone always had to. Her leadership was not for the loud moments, but for the slow ones, the ones that actually determined whether people survived. And so she continued, year after year. Even as Rome's grip tightened, the ceremonies did not stop. The bindings were still performed. The linen was still wrapped. The water still rose and receded, soft and indifferent to empire. If the quiet held you longer than you meant, just say so. Even now, as the final year of Cleopatra's reign unfolded, the ceremonies did not falter. If anything, they became more deliberate, more carefully timed, as if she were preparing Egypt itself for what was coming. The political horizon had darkened. Beyond pretense, Octavian's forces were no longer a distant rumor, but an approaching certainty. Antony's last stand was unfolding, and the Roman world was already rehearsing Cleopatra's downfall before it had even happened. Yet within Alexandria, in the hollow spaces of the temples, and along the cool stone banks of the Nile, the rituals continued as they always had. They were not abandoned for the sake of war. They were sustained because war made them more necessary. Cleopatra, despite the growing pressures of diplomacy and military defense, prioritized the seasonal rites with a precision that seems almost unimaginable to modern historians, accustomed to framing history in terms of battles and treaties. She understood that even in collapse, some patterns must not be broken. The Nile's flood still needed to be greeted. The temple offerings still needed to be made. The people still needed to see that their queen stood in continuity with the land, not apart from it. This was not escapism. It was responsibility, held softly, but with unshakable resolve. In the summer of that final year, as Roman ships gathered near the coasts and spies reported on every whisper within Alexandria's palace walls, Cleopatra attended the festival of the first flood. It was a quiet event compared to Rome's spectacles of conquest. There were no marching banners or trumpets, no proclamations carved into public squares. Instead, the festival unfolded in the early dawn, when the first signs of the river's rise became visible, muddy waters pressing softly against the banks, carrying fragments of silt from lands hundreds of miles upstream. The priests marked the moment with ceremonial chants, voices barely louder than breath, repeating phrases older than memory. Cleopatra was there in person, not as an observer, but as a participant. She stepped into the water at the temple's designated threshold, her feet bare, her robes trailing in the shallow current. The air was heavy with mist, but the moment was clear. She held a small vessel, an alabaster cup filled with a symbolic portion of the Nile's first offering of the season. This water, collected and held for a breath of time, was then poured back into the river, a gesture that signified both gratitude and humility. It was not a sacrifice. It was a recognition that Egypt did not own the river. It borrowed life from it, season by season. This kind of ritual might seem small compared to the movements of armies or the drafting of political decrees, but Cleopatra knew it was not small at all. It was central. She understood, as few rulers have, that the stability of a nation is built as much in soft repetition as in military strength. It's in the ceremonies that no one documents, the quiet acknowledgments of dependence on forces beyond human control. In this act of pouring the river back into itself, she was maintaining the social and spiritual fabric of Egypt in the face of encroaching collapse. That morning, after the ritual, she walked with the priests back to the temple. No grand speeches were given. There was no need. The message had already been delivered, not to Rome, not to the world beyond Alexandria's walls, but to the farmers who watched from a respectful distance, to the temple scribes who recorded the event in soft ink on papyrus scrolls, to the attendants who would prepare the next rites in the days to come. The queen was still there, still participating in the ceremonies that tied Egypt to its land, its river, its seasons. Historians often ask why Cleopatra maintained these traditions so rigorously when her political reality was collapsing around her. The answer is simple and deeply human, because the rituals were never about personal power. They were about continuity. Even in the face of military defeat, there were fields that needed planting, grain that needed counting, priests who needed to chant the old prayers, not for superstition, but for structure, for the steadying of a world unraveling at the edges. After the festival, Cleopatra spent more time than usual consulting with the temple astronomers. These were not just discussions about stars for navigation or omens for war. They were about the agricultural calendar, about when to begin sowing, when to anticipate the next flood, when to adjust the rhythms of life around the soft realities of nature. She worked with the scribes to ensure that, no matter what happened politically, the kingdom's records would remain intact. The measurements of the flood were preserved. The grain ledgers were updated. The temple stores were managed with the same meticulous care as before, because she understood that life would continue beyond her reign, and someone would need those records to rebuild whatever came next. There's a fragment of writing from this period, faint, nearly erased by time, that describes a conversation between Cleopatra and one of the temple elders. According to the account, she asked him whether the Nile would still rise if Rome took Alexandria. The priest's answer, preserved only in pieces, was simple. The river remembers what we do, not who we are. It's unclear whether these were his exact words, but the sentiment aligns with everything Cleopatra practiced. She knew that her name could be erased from Roman accounts, that her story would be rewritten by victors. But she also knew the river carried a memory deeper than history books, a memory kept in flood patterns, in the soft grooves along the Nilometer walls, in the ritual cycles that continued regardless of empire. Even in her private moments, she seemed to hold this truth close. Her advisors urged her to prepare for final negotiations with Octavian, to consider the last lines of defense, to arrange safe passage for Caesarion, but she still made time for the flood readings, for the grain reports, for the quiet walks through temple courtyards where water still flowed in ceremonial basins. These were not distractions. They were her real work, the maintenance of Egypt's pulse, the gentle tethering of human life to the larger patterns that made existence possible. It is tempting to romanticize this, to imagine Cleopatra as a tragic figure standing against the inevitable, but that would miss the point. She was not resisting change. She was stewarding continuity in the only way that made sense to her, by ensuring that the rituals endured. Even when kingdoms fell, her leadership was not rooted in denial, but but in a quiet acceptance of her role as caretaker of something larger than herself. She knew the ships were coming. She knew Rome's stories would soon replace Egypt's in the records of power, but she also knew the river would still rise. The fields would still require tending, and the soft, hollow prayers of the temple would still echo long after marble statues had crumbled into dust. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. As the last days of Cleopatra's rule approached, the city of Alexandria held its breath in a way that is difficult to capture through written history alone. Outside the palace walls, the streets remained busy, merchants hawking goods, fishermen bringing in their morning catch, the hum of ordinary life continuing as if the horizon had not shifted. But beneath that surface, there was an unspoken awareness, an understanding that something was ending, and that the next chapter, whatever it might be, would not resemble what had come before. Cleopatra did not retreat from these final days, nor did she descend into isolation. Instead, she pressed deeper into the patterns. She had always trusted the rhythms of the Nile, the rituals of the temples, the systems that made Egypt more than a political entity. Even as Rome closed in, she chose to continue the ceremonies. There was no political gain to be had from them at that point, at least not in the Roman sense. Octavian would not be deterred by a temple procession or a sacred chant, but Cleopatra understood that the ceremonies were not for Rome. They were for Egypt. They were for the people who still depended on the flood, who still needed grain in the granaries and water in the fields, who still measured their lives by the rise and fall of the river, not by the rise and fall of foreign powers. One of the last rites she performed was the renewal of the waters, an annual ceremony that marked the river's full arrival into its season of abundance. Traditionally, the ceremony involved both the queen and the priests standing before the sacred basins in the temple's inner courtyard, pouring water over the carved representations of the land itself, a symbolic act of nourishment, of soft care, of tending to the earth as one tends to a child. Cleopatra did not cancel this ritual, even though Roman ships already hovered near Egypt's shores, and Octavian's messengers were arriving with demands thinly disguised as negotiations. She stood in the temple as she always had, her hands steady, her gaze soft but unwavering. The water she poured that day was gathered from the first of the Nile's floodwaters, a mixture of silt and current, carrying the fingerprints of upstream rains and mountain tributaries. When she tipped the vessel, letting the water glide over stone representations of fields and crops, she was not performing for political theater. She was maintaining a covenant, one she had honored every year of her reign. The priests whispered the same phrases they had spoken for generations, voices soft, steady, and slow. They spoke not of empire, but of balance, of cycles, of the fragile arrangement between nature and need. That day, Cleopatra also visited the temple archives, reviewing the records of past floods. The priests maintained scrolls that detailed the Nile's patterns, carefully inked notations of height, duration, and silt quality. These were not ceremonial documents. They were agricultural data, practical records of when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare for scarcity. Cleopatra read through them, tracing her fingers along the margins, noting the years of high floods, the years of drought. Her governance had always included this layer, the management of the unseen, the observation of patterns that carried more weight than military reports or diplomatic alliances. Her advisors urged her to prioritize defense. They brought her news of Octavian's approaching forces, of Antony's deteriorating position, of the likely impossibility of victory. But Cleopatra kept her attention on Egypt's inner workings. She reviewed grain storage totals. She ensured that temple distributions to the rural provinces remained stable. She instructed her scribes to continue recording not just political events, but the river's behavior, the astronomical markers, the agricultural cycles. There was a deliberate calm in this, a refusal to allow collapse in one area to trigger collapse in all. Some historians call this denial, but perhaps it was something closer to wisdom. Cleopatra knew that even if Alexandria fell, the Nile would still flood. The farmers in Upper Egypt would still plant when the waters receded. The temple rites, if preserved, would continue to mark time in a way no Roman governor would fully understand. Her legacy, she suspected, might not live in Roman records, but it would survive in the rhythms of the land, in the hollow spaces between ceremonies where breath and river met in quiet agreement. There's an account, passed down through fragmented temple records, that during these final days, she ordered the construction of additional storage for grain, not because she expected to use it herself, but because she wanted the reserves to last beyond her reign. This act was not political in the usual sense. It was an acknowledgement of continuity beyond personal survival. Cleopatra was not preparing Egypt for her own success. She was preparing it to outlast her failure, to endure. The world beyond Egypt was changing rapidly. Rome's republic was transforming into an empire. New leaders were being carved into marble, their names prepared for the mouths of poets and historians alike. Cleopatra, however, placed her attention elsewhere. She focused on preserving the layers of Egypt that couldn't be conquered, not through force, not through annexation, not through propaganda. She focused on the rituals of grain and water, on the soft ties between people and land that had held for thousands of years and, she hoped, would hold still longer. When the final messages arrived from Octavian, demanding surrender, Cleopatra answered them not just with political strategy, but with ritual acts. She performed the offering of the horizon, a ceremony marking the closing of one cycle and the beginning of another. Standing before the dawn, in the temple courtyard facing east, she offered incense to the sky, poured libations to the earth, and whispered the same words spoken by her ancestors. Let the day arrive. Let the night retreat. Let the river remember. These words were not meant to change the course of history in a military sense. They were meant to preserve a different kind of memory, one that could not be erased by conquest, because it lived in repetition, in the quiet acts of care that hold civilizations together even when their leaders fall. In the days that followed, Cleopatra made her final political moves, but her attention remained tethered to the cycles she had spent her life maintaining. She met with priests, scribes, astronomers, and farmers, ensuring that the harvest would proceed, regardless of what happened to her. She issued instructions for the temple schools to continue teaching the rituals, the chants, the agricultural management that had kept Egypt stable for generations. Even as Rome prepared to write her ending, she focused on making sure Egypt's story would not end with her. The Nile did not stop rising because Rome won. The river's soft current continued, indifferent to empire, and Cleopatra, in her last acts of leadership, made sure Egypt's breath aligned with that current one final time. If your breath has disappeared into the dark, that's good. That's where the rest of this belongs. By the time Cleopatra reached the final weeks of her life, the distinction between governance, ritual, and survival had blurred completely. There was no more separation between the ceremonial and the strategic, no clear line dividing religious duty from political necessity. Everything had collapsed into a single focus, preserving the elements of Egypt that Rome could not take. Inside the palace, she met daily with her advisors, but these meetings no longer resembled the diplomatic councils of earlier years. The tone had shifted. Discussions of alliances had given way to the logistics of endings, what to preserve, what to hide, what to send away. The treasures of Alexandria's libraries were being catalogued for possible safekeeping. Certain scrolls, those that contained the agricultural records, the flood patterns, the temple scripts that described the ceremonies of the Nile were prioritized, not because they carried political value, but because they held the structure of life itself. Cleopatra knew that Rome could conquer the walls of Alexandria, but it was harder to conquer memory, especially when that memory was tied to cycles of water, planting, and time. She spent these days alternating Between the war councils and the temple courtyards, there are accounts, mostly passed down through temple oral tradition, that she walked the halls of Philae and Edfu during these final weeks, touching the carved reliefs with her fingertips, as if to remind herself of what continuity felt like beneath her hands. She met with priests in the hollow hours of night, speaking not of Rome but of the flood, of grain reserves, of the coming harvest. She instructed the scribes to continue recording the Nile's measurements, even as Roman legions stood poised at Egypt's borders. Some historians, with their fixation on the political spectacle of her final days, have wondered why she maintained these duties when the collapse of her reign seemed inevitable. But Cleopatra was never simply governing for her own survival. She was preparing Egypt to endure what came next. Her understanding of leadership had always been broader than her own reign. She believed in the preservation of systems, not just dynasties, but the actual systems of survival, the flow of water, the timing of harvests, the ceremonies that linked human life to the natural world in ways no conqueror could undo overnight. Her last visits to the Nilometer were not ceremonial performances for the court. They were practical acts. She wanted to know the exact state of the flood, to understand what the next season might bring, not because she expected to rule through it, but because someone would need that knowledge after she was gone. Her final readings were recorded in temple archives, noted carefully alongside the measurements of years past. Even in the shadow of defeat, she ensured the flood's data remained intact, knowing that the people would still need guidance about when to plant, when to store, when to wait. There's a recorded observation, written down decades later by a temple scribe who survived the transition into Roman rule, describing how Cleopatra carried herself in these final moments. He wrote that she moved like someone carrying water, not in haste, but in balance, careful not to spill. This metaphor captures something most accounts of her life miss. She wasn't scrambling for power in these last days. She was managing loss with precision, pouring what remained of Egypt's sovereignty into vessels that could survive conquest. When the time came for Antony's final defeat and Octavian's forces entered Alexandria, Cleopatra maintained control of what she still could. She met with her advisors for the last time, not to plan escape routes, but to assign responsibilities for the care of Egypt's religious and agricultural institutions. She ensured that the temple granaries would continue distributing grain to rural provinces, regardless of who sat on the throne. She instructed that the flood rituals not be interrupted, no matter who arrived at the palace gates. There's a deep wisdom in this kind of governance, one that Rome never fully grasped. The empire understood conquest, understood how to plant flags and erect statues, but it did not understand how to manage the soft, slow work of continuity. Cleopatra did. Her final acts as queen were not about legacy in the way Roman leaders thought of legacy. She wasn't concerned with having her face carved into new coins or her name etched into the triumphal arches of foreign cities. She was concerned with the invisible scaffolding of life grain stores, flood charts, ceremonial knowledge, the things that actually kept a nation alive when borders changed and rulers vanished from history books. When she finally chose to end her life, tradition holds that she did so in a way consistent with her understanding of control. She made the decision herself, not allowing Rome to parade her through the streets of victory as a conquered queen. But even in this final act, she left instructions for the temple systems to remain untouched. She left the priests their roles. She left the rites intact. She ensured that the ceremonies of the Nile, the offerings, the chants, the calendar of planting and harvest would continue. Her death was not the end of those things, because she had built her rule on something deeper than personal survival. There is no grand Roman record of these soft decisions. Octavian's historians preferred to write about her death as a cautionary tale of excess and downfall, folding her story into the propaganda that built his empire. But in Egypt, the temples continued the ceremonies. The flood came again the following year, as it always did, and the priests spoke her name softly during the rites, not as a goddess, but as a caretaker, who had fulfilled her role until the last possible moment. Some of the inscriptions from this period survive in fragments. 1. Barely legible. Carved into a wall in Upper Egypt. Reads, "She gave the river back to itself." The phrase is not an accusation, nor is it a lament. It's a statement of fact. Cleopatra, in the end, returned Egypt to its cycles, to its breath, to the soft governance of time and tide. She didn't save her throne, but she safeguarded the rhythm of the land. She ensured that the Nile's name remained whispered in the correct way, that the grain would be measured according to the old charts, that the balance between flood and field would be kept by those who knew how to listen. After Rome took Egypt, after the temples were eventually stripped of much of their power, and after the cults of the old gods faded into the dust of history, the river still rose. The ceremonies, though hollowed over time, echoed faintly for centuries, and beneath the layers of conquest and forgetting, Cleopatra's soft governance lingered in the flood records, in the margins of temple scrolls, in the whispered prayers of farmers who still turned their faces toward the Nile at dawn, long after empires had stopped watching. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. After Cleopatra's death, Rome took Alexandria, but it did not fully understand what it had acquired. To Roman eyes, Egypt was now a conquered province, its wealth and grain shipments redirected toward imperial coffers, its temples reduced to exotic curiosities, its rituals reclassified as local color rather than essential systems. But the priests of the Nile, the farmers in the delta, and the scribes who tended the flood records understood differently. They knew that conquest was a loud thing, but survival happened quietly, in the soft continuation of tasks too ordinary for empire to notice. The river did not pause to acknowledge the shift in rule. It kept rising, as it always had, carrying silt from distant mountains, feeding the fields, marking the calendar in its own patient language. Rome planted banners and changed official titles, but it could not change the flood, and for a time, the temples still followed Cleopatra's instructions. The rites continued. The readings of the nilometer remained consistent. The grain was counted. The ceremonies of first water and last harvest were performed in whispered tones, just as they had been before conquest came. The priests, many of whom had worked closely with Cleopatra during her final years, quietly preserved the systems she had protected. They understood that while Rome had taken the throne, it had not yet taken the rhythm of the land. For years after her death, they continued to record the flood cycles on temple walls and papyrus scrolls, tracking the behavior of the Nile with the same careful precision Cleopatra had insisted upon. Some of these records survive today, water-stained and brittle, but still legible in places. They speak not of political change, but of river heights, of planting schedules, of the small adjustments made when the floods came early or late. In these notations, there is no mention of Rome. This was Cleopatra's real legacy, not the alliances with Rome's generals, not the battles lost or won, but the maintenance of the systems that allowed Egypt to continue feeding itself, regardless of who ruled. She had understood something about empire that Rome did not, that conquest is an event, but survival is a process. Rome could dismantle a court, but it could not easily dismantle a calendar of planting and harvest that had been in place for millennia. There's a quiet irony in this. Octavian, later, Augustus, returned to Rome triumphant. Having claimed Egypt for the empire, statues were raised, coins were minted with his image. Historians were instructed to frame Cleopatra as a cautionary tale, a queen undone by her ambition, her indulgences, her alliances. But while Rome celebrated its victory in marble and metal, the Nile continued its soft work, moving silt across fields, nurturing the land, carrying forward a memory of Egypt that empire could not so easily overwrite. The temples slowly changed. Of course, over time, Roman governors imposed new regulations, shrank the authority of the priesthoods, redirected religious attention toward Roman deities. But in rural areas, Far from Alexandria's new administrative centers, the old rhythms persisted. Farmers still turned their eyes toward the river at dawn. They still watched for the color of the floodwaters, still listened for the soft sounds that signaled planting time. The rituals were whispered more quietly now, sometimes behind closed temple doors, sometimes in homes where elders taught children the old ways in the hush of early morning. Some of these acts of remembrance were practical, not just spiritual. Knowing when the flood would come meant knowing when to store grain, when to prepare irrigation canals, when to set the rhythms of daily life. Cleopatra had made sure that these systems were not left vulnerable to conquest. She had ensured that the knowledge remained in the hands of the people who used it, not locked away in palace archives, but preserved in temples, fields, and the soft, repetitive gestures of ordinary life. It's difficult to know how much of this continuity was conscious resistance, and how much was simply habit, the inertia of a civilization so deeply tied to the Nile that even conquest couldn't sever the connection. But perhaps it doesn't matter. The result was the same. Egypt continued, not as a sovereign kingdom, but as a living system, its people bound to the river in ways that political maps cannot describe. The memory of Cleopatra herself became complicated after her death. Rome's writers ensured that she would be remembered in the ways most convenient for them, as a femme fatale, as a manipulator of men, as a woman who overreached and fell. But in Egypt, particularly among those who worked the land and tended the temples, a different memory persisted. They remembered a queen who stood beside the river, who whispered to the flood, who made sure the granaries stayed full, even when the world outside shifted toward collapse. They remembered someone who chose to keep the soft machinery of life turning, long after the loud machinery of empire had begun to fail. There's a fragment from an anonymous Egyptian scribe, written decades after Cleopatra's death, that captures this memory in its own quiet way. It reads, "She watched the river as others watched the throne." It's a small line, buried in a longer text about agricultural cycles, but it reveals something essential about how she was seen by those who lived beyond the courts and councils. To them, her greatness was not in her alliances with Rome or in her political maneuvering, but in her attention to the rhythms that actually determined whether people lived or starved. Long after the Romans restructured Egypt's administration, long after new governors came and went, the floods still came each year. The temples, even as they lost their political influence, continued to send priests to the river's edge to measure the water, to mark the season's start, to whisper the old phrases into the air. And somewhere in those whispered rites, Cleopatra's legacy lingered not as a symbol of failure, but as a symbol of care, of stewardship, of the quiet work required to hold a world together even as it falls apart at the edges. Eventually, the Roman Empire would forget the details. Statues would crumble, temples would close, languages would shift, dynasties would rise and fall, but the Nile would continue, slow and soft, carrying silt down from the mountains, feeding the land, washing over the hollow spaces where history forgets, but life remembers. And in the curve of that current, there would remain the faint echo of a queen who understood that power isn't always about who wins the loudest battle. Sometimes it's about who listens long enough to keep the fields alive. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. Centuries passed, but the Nile kept moving, its soft current brushing against the same stones Cleopatra had once touched. Empires shifted, Rome expanded, collapsed, and gave way to newer powers. Languages changed, new rulers came, carving their names into walls already crowded with older ones. But the river didn't care for these transitions. It continued its quiet work, rising and falling with the same patience it had always kept. And in small villages along its banks, the people continued to measure time by water, not by rulers. There is something profound in this, the idea that survival often belongs to the systems that don't announce themselves. Egypt's ceremonies, especially those tied to the Nile, were not designed for spectacle. They were designed for continuity. Cleopatra had understood this better than most. In her final years, she had ensured that the flood rituals were woven so deeply into the daily fabric of life that even Rome's annexation could not entirely unthread them. The rites were no longer merely royal obligations. They had become part of the soft architecture of memory, carried not by officials but by farmers, temple attendants, and families who lived near the water's edge. Over generations, the names attached to the ceremonies faded. The specific chants blurred at the edges, but the gestures remained, even as Rome imposed new calendars and decrees. The people along the Nile still stepped into the river at certain times of the year, still made small offerings, sometimes just a handful of grain, sometimes a whispered word, no longer fully understood, but still spoken because it felt necessary. In these moments, Cleopatra's legacy did not survive as a figure of political history, but as a caretaker of rhythm. A woman remembered not for how she died, but for how she tended to the flow of life beneath empire's noise. Some Roman administrators tried to dismantle the older systems after her death. They replaced temple officials with Roman overseers. They issued new rules about grain distribution, redirecting more of Egypt's harvest toward Rome. They attempted to centralize control, imagining that paperwork and taxation could replace the slower, more ancient management of seasons and flood cycles. But they found that Egypt's real governance had always happened elsewhere, not in palaces, but in the quiet spaces where river and field met. In the long, hollow hours when people waited for water to rise, Rome could reorganize provinces, but it could not rewrite the river's schedule. For a time, this created a strange duality. On the surface, Egypt was a Roman province. Its official documents bore Roman seals. Its officials reported to Rome. But beneath that administrative layer, the old systems pulsed quietly on. Farmers continued to read the Nile, to plant and harvest according to its moods. In remote temples, even as Roman statues were erected, the priests kept copies of the old flood records, maintaining the continuity Cleopatra had protected. These actions were not rebellion. They were not political statements. They were simply the work of survival, soft, unnoticed, but essential. Cleopatra's name, in these contexts, became less about the woman herself and more about the role she had played. She became, in memory, a figure woven into the fabric of the river, a symbol of care rather than conquest. The villagers who spoke of her did not tell stories about Caesar or Antony. They spoke of the queen who watched the water, who listened when others commanded, who aligned her breath with the seasons instead of trying to outpace them. In this version of history, the quiet, oral version, not written into Roman records, Cleopatra did not fall from power. She dissolved into the systems she preserved. Some of this memory survives even now, though only in fragments. In later centuries, travelers along the Nile reported hearing stories from local guides about the queen who spoke to the river. These tales are often dismissed as folklore, but they reveal something deeper about how history embeds itself into place. People remember through landscape. They attach memory to rivers, to stones, to ceremonies that repeat not because someone demands it, but because life makes more sense when they do. Cleopatra's story, in this sense, became part of the land's own rhythm. There's a kind of victory in that, not the loud, immediate victory of conquest, but the soft, enduring victory of influence that slips beneath empire's radar. Rome could take statues, cities, even grain, but it could not entirely take the way people lived. The rituals continued, altered perhaps, but never fully erased. The Nile remained the teacher, and Cleopatra remained, in a way, its last attentive student. Later rulers tried to replicate what she had done, but few understood the subtlety of it. They built monuments to themselves, issued decrees, taxed the land harder than the land could bear. They thought leadership was about control. Cleopatra had known better. She had learned from the Nile that control is often an illusion, that real leadership is about tending to the fragile balance between human need and natural force, about knowing when to act and when to wait, when to intervene and when to let the river decide. When you trace the historical records from that time, you can see where Rome's narratives end and Egypt's quieter story begins. The official accounts stop with Cleopatra's death. They declare her reign concluded, her alliances broken, her political games lost. But the flood records don't stop. The temple calendars continue. The grain ledgers pick up the next season without pause. There's no rupture in the cycles of planting and harvest. No missing year in the chronicles of the Nile's behavior. The work goes on. This is not the kind of legacy Rome valued, but it is the kind that lasts. Today, when historians study Cleopatra, they often focus on her charisma, her political cunning, her role in Rome's civil wars. But beneath all of that noise lies this quieter truth. She was one of the last rulers of her time to understand that power is not just about territory or influence. It is about care. It is about tending to systems that predate politics, about respecting the hollow spaces where ceremony and survival overlap. She did not just reign over Egypt, she inhabited it, listening to the river, maintaining the patterns that allowed people to eat, to breathe, to continue. There's something restful in this realization, that not all stories of rule must end in triumph or tragedy. Some can end in soft continuation, in the decision to preserve what matters even when everything else falls away. Cleopatra's final years were not marked by dramatic speeches or grand battles, though history tends to remember those louder moments first. Her real legacy, the one that outlived the Roman accounts, was the continuity of the Nile's whisper, the persistence of the flood cycle, the ceremonies that continued even after the statues crumbled. If something in here found you first, say so, just once. By the time Rome tightened its grip fully over Egypt, most of the world believed Cleopatra's story had ended. Her death had been turned into legend, wrapped in the kind of details that empires love: poison, betrayal, serpents, whispered farewells. Octavian's poets and historians sculpted her legacy into something convenient, a warning about ambition, a symbol of exotic excess, a footnote in the grand narrative of Roman triumph. But beneath that official history, Egypt continued living by older rhythms, and in those rhythms, Cleopatra's presence never truly left. The Roman administration, efficient in its accounting but blind to subtleties, took control of Alexandria's bureaucracy and temple revenues. Officials arrived from Rome to manage grain exports, supervise taxation, and convert local governance into an appendage of the empire's growing stomach. Yet even as they counted shipments and issued new decrees, the priests of the Nile kept measuring water levels. The farmers kept planting by the flood's timetable, not by Rome's calendars. In the countryside, far from the Roman administrator's view, life followed the same path it had always followed, the path Cleopatra had protected until the very last moment. Her son, Caesarion, was executed shortly after her death. Rome made sure of that. Octavian had no intention of leaving behind a rival claimant to the memory of Julius Caesar or to Egypt's throne. But while Cleopatra's bloodline was extinguished in Rome's political sense, her deeper lineage, the caretaking of the land, the rituals of the river, persisted. In the temples, Caesarion's name was quietly included in the liturgies for several years after his death, whispered by priests who understood that ceremonial memory is softer and more persistent than political memory. The Romans could remove a boy from the throne, but they could not remove his name from the breath of prayers spoken into stone chambers at dawn. This is how Egypt carried its past forward, not with rebellion, but with quiet repetition. Cleopatra had made sure of it. Before her death, she had instructed the priests to continue the rites exactly as they always had, regardless of who sat in the palace. She had ensured that the flood records remained untouched, that the nilometer readings were maintained without interruption, that the scribes recorded not only the rise and fall of the river, but also the rituals themselves, how to perform them, when to speak the words, how to align the ceremonies with the moon's phases and the stars' positions. This was her final governance, rendered invisible to those who looked only for thrones and crowns. In the villages along the Nile, Cleopatra's name softened into something less political and more elemental. Over generations, the stories about her shifted. She became the queen who cared for the river, the woman who whispered to the flood, who made sure the granaries stayed full, and the farmers knew when to plant. Some said she could hear the Nile's real name, the one only spoken between water and sky. Others said she had woven herself into the cycle so deeply that the river still carried traces of her breath. Of course, these stories cannot be verified in the way modern history demands. They belong to the realm of oral tradition, of folk memory, of the soft persistence of myth woven into daily life. But there's a truth in them nonetheless, a truth about the kind of leadership that doesn't end when armies march in or borders are redrawn. Cleopatra had become more than a figure in a court. She had become part of the land's memory, her instructions for the temples, her stewardship of the flood records, her insistence on continuity, even in the face of collapse. These choices allowed parts of Egypt to survive quietly, beneath the notice of empire. Even centuries later, when Roman rule gave way to new empires, when languages shifted and temples crumbled, fragments of this memory remained. Travelers in the medieval period recorded hearing tales from Nile boatmen about a queen who had spoken to the waters, who had disappeared into the river's whisper rather than into Rome's stone halls. Her name, in some regions, became blurred with older goddesses. Woven into the myths of Isis and the Nile itself, she was no longer just a historical figure. She was part of the land's soft breath, a hollow echo that slipped between fact and symbol. In the archives of the later temples, those that survived Rome's conversion of Egypt into a grain-supplying province, there are records of flood measurements that continue uninterrupted from Cleopatra's time through decades of Roman rule. The same scribes who once recorded her participation in the rituals kept writing, their ink strokes unchanged, their calendars aligned not with Rome's imperial clocks, but with the river's patient rise and fall. These records do not mention the conquest. They do not record the names of Roman governors. They simply list the flood heights, the timing of planting, the management of grain reserves. In these documents, Cleopatra's governance never really ended. It flowed on, embedded in the practices she left behind. There's something quietly defiant about this. Empires prefer endings that are clean, final, stamped with dates and monuments. But the Nile does not operate on imperial timelines. It does not stop because a queen dies or a new ruler issues decrees. It continues, carrying silt and memory with equal softness, erasing and recording at the same time. Cleopatra understood this better than any of her conquerors did. Her final acts were not about saving herself. They were about embedding herself into that larger current, ensuring that Egypt's deeper systems, its cycles, its ceremonies, its quiet agreements with water and earth would outlast the noise of conquest. By the time Rome realized that Egypt had not truly been remade in its image, it was too late. The temples had closed, but the knowledge had already slipped into the fields, into the farmers' hands, into the soft repetitions of daily life. Even as Roman officials carved new administrative titles onto stone, Egypt's people continued measuring time by the river, aligning their work with the old patterns. Cleopatra's work had succeeded, not in the way Rome recorded success, but in the way survival demands it. Near the end of one surviving flood record, written decades after her death, there's a small note in the margin, likely added by a scribe who remembered the queen personally. It reads, "The flood came quietly this year, as she would have wished." The line is not a political statement. It is not a rebellion. It is simply an observation, folded into the rhythms of life, acknowledging that some legacies are not made of stone, but of silence, of water, of the soft continuation of things no empire can quite stop. If the quiet held you longer than you meant, just say so, even now. In the centuries that followed, Egypt's temples gradually emptied. Some were abandoned to sand and wind, their carvings faded by time, their columns left to the patience of ruin. Others were converted, repurposed into shrines for new rulers and new gods, their sacred chambers filled with echoes rather than chants. Yet even as the visible structures of Cleopatra's Egypt receded, something less tangible remained: a pattern, a rhythm, a set of soft instructions whispered beneath the louder layers of history. This is the part of her story that rarely appears in textbooks. Historians have focused, understandably, on her political alliances, her negotiations with Caesar, her final alliance with Antony. They have detailed the fall of Alexandria, the symbolic power of her death, the moment Octavian took Egypt into Rome's expanding empire. But those events, while dramatic, did not capture the whole of what Cleopatra preserved. She had left something behind that could not be marched into a triumphal parade or stamped onto Roman coinage. Her true legacy lived in the cycles she refused to abandon, in the ceremonies she maintained until her final breath, in the grain stores she ordered protected, not for herself, but for the seasons beyond her lifetime, in the flood records she insisted remain accurate, knowing that agriculture, not empire, would determine whether Egypt's people continued to live. She was not a queen who governed for monuments. She was a caretaker of breath and water, of planting times and harvest schedules, of the hollow agreements between land and life that do not disappear when armies arrive. Over time, as Roman administrators restructured Egypt, they could not fully dismantle this foundation, even as new governors imposed taxes, reorganized provinces, and introduced imperial cults. The people of Egypt kept watching the river, they kept measuring the flood, they kept tending to the same systems Cleopatra had protected, not because they were ordered to, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The Nile demanded attention, regardless of who ruled from Alexandria's palaces. In some of the last temple inscriptions before the priesthoods faded entirely, there are references to the Lady of the Waters, a figure who is sometimes identified with Isis, sometimes with the land itself, but occasionally softly, indirectly with Cleopatra. The lines are spare, cautious, perhaps written with the knowledge that Rome no longer permitted open veneration of old kings and queens. But the sentiment is clear. One inscription reads, "She kept the flood's name safe." Another simply says, "She remembered the measure of the river." These are not grand declarations. They are acknowledgments of continuity, of someone who held the thread long enough for it to pass into other hands. By then, the details of her life had already begun to blur into legend. In village stories, she became less a queen of political intrigue and more a guardian of the Nile's quiet needs. Some said she could still be seen, in certain seasons, standing at the water's edge in the first light of dawn, checking the river's height. Others claimed she had become part of the river itself, her breath folded into the mist that rose from its surface, her voice now inseparable from the hollow sounds of water moving over stone. These stories are not meant for accuracy, they are meant for survival. They carry the memory of a leader who chose to align herself with natural cycles, rather than the brittle timelines of conquest. Cleopatra knew the limits of empire. She knew that Rome could take statues, ships, palaces, but it could not so easily take the systems beneath all that. The soft agreements between season and soil, between river and field, between ruler and ritual. Those structures were not written in marble. They were written in repetition, in daily acts of care, in the kind of leadership that does not always announce itself, but simply continues, quietly, because it must. The priests who recorded the last of the flood data after her death understood this. Their scrolls do not describe her downfall. They do not mention Antony or Octavian, not because those events were unimportant, but because they belong to a different register of history. Their focus remained on the watermarks left along the stone columns of the Nilometer, the timing of the Sirius star rising in the morning sky, the calendar of planting and harvest. To them, Cleopatra's real contributions had little to do with Rome and everything to do with ensuring that Egypt's breath remained aligned with its land. Today, when archaeologists uncover these records, they find layers of continuity that defy the official narratives of conquest. The flood logs from her reign blend seamlessly into those of the Roman period. The measurements do not skip or break. There is no year zero, no dramatic pause where empire changed hands. The river continued. The people continued. The rituals, adapted slightly perhaps, still unfolded. And in that soft persistence, Cleopatra's governance outlived her empire. Her death was a moment, but the systems she preserved were centuries. There's something deeply human in this, not the drama of rise and fall, but the quiet maintenance of life's necessities. We often tell history through the lens of victories and defeats, of speeches and declarations, of who sat on which throne and for how long. But beneath all of that is another kind of history, the one that happens when someone makes sure the grain is stored for winter, when someone checks the flood levels, when someone teaches a child how to read the river's signs so that the next planting will not fail. Cleopatra's final acts belong to this layer. She chose not to control the narrative of Rome, but to protect the infrastructure of life. This is why her story lingers, quietly. Even when the official records forget, it lingers in the water that still moves through Egypt's fields, in the agricultural calendars that trace back, in part, the systems she refined, in the temples, now worn and hollow, where echoes of the old chants still seem to settle into the stones, in the farmers who, generation after generation, continued to turn their faces toward the Nile at the same time each year, waiting for the water, listening for its soft arrival. Perhaps this is the final measure of her reign, not how she died, but how she kept Egypt breathing, even as the rest of the world closed in. Her governance dissolved into the cycles she tended, becoming indistinguishable from the flow of life itself. You've heard enough for now. Let the story finish itself without you. And if you're still awake, maybe the silence felt less alone this time. This was Boring History Nights. Until next time, drift softly and stay